Wondered where you guys were.
It's a good problem to have.
Hey, is that Eric I see in the background?
Nice.
Hey, haven't seen you in a while.
Hey, yeah, I was out on paternity leave for...
Well, you too. But hadn't seen Eric Toon on this call in a while.
Can you guys hear us okay? I guess you can since you spoke to Daniel. And we're already recording it. Life is good.
Welcome everybody. Looks like some people have already added some stuff to the agenda. I want to add one other thing. My tabs, hopefully you guys
Sound really dim to anybody else?
Oh, am I not loud enough? Oh, yeah.
The mic is in the
Yeah.
There we go.
shadow.
Yeah, is this better?
Yeah, much better, thank you.
Okay. I'll try to look at the microphone when I talk. Should we start at the top?
If you wouldn't mind, please.
Do you want to share your screen? Or?
Let's see. Can I do that? I have to sign in, wouldn't I?
Yeah, you should open the Zoom link.
Yeah. Well, I'm not sure.
I can do that.
I'm not sure what's going to happen because if I sign in, it will also be SIG API Machinery.
Oh, you don't actually have to be signed into Zoom. An anonymous person can do this.
All right. Okay.
That's right.
Go ahead. I think Maddie's going to sort of share his screen, and you can begin.
Okay. So improved open API aggregation. Somebody put this on the agenda. Is there anything to discuss on this, or is it?
I just want to make sure that we were all aware that it was there, that it was coming in, and I think from our side, this looks to be on track and close to merging.
Yeah.
Not sure if you guys had any reservations or if you noticed it.
Is that how you feel about it, Maddie?
I wasn't listening, sorry.
Oh.
I was opening the...
Yeah.
Sorry, can you repeat that? Sorry.
Sure. I was just saying that I thought your pull for the improved API aggregation was on track. It was going to merge before freeze, and I didn't see anything that was going to block it.
Yep.
Yeah, okay, good.
That's accurate, yeah.
The other one that I put on here is larger and to my knowledge hasn't been thoroughly reviewed yet. It's one for making shared informers include uninitialized objects. And I think it needs attention. It's Chow's, and I'm going to guess Chow agrees it needs attention.
Yes, I need some reviewers. Maddie, I think Maddie had looked through it.
Yeah, I looked at it. I added at least one comment. I'm going to do that again, but if somebody else want to help there too, that would be awesome.
Yeah, I want to have a conversation with this one about you, or about it with you, Chow. Because I had a conversation with you and one with Eric, and we came to different conclusions. So maybe all three of us should have a little hallway chat.
Okay, tack it on the end of the agenda if you want.
I don't know that everybody needs to.
Yeah, I listed it here just so that we would make sure that it was called to attention and it wasn't going to fall through the cracks, because I recognize it as an important one.
Okay. Next, Piotr, Metrics API?
Yeah, so basically there is Master Metrics API in alpha, and you would like to graduate this to beta in 1.8. The question is, when the API was introduced, there was no concept of object reference in the API.
If somebody should mute, I guess.
Okay, so there was no concept of object reference in the API back in time. So we decided basically to design this API in not very, like we assume that for each pod there will be a resource of pod metrics, which has exactly the same name and exactly the same namespace, and it will be representing the metrics from the original pod. So the reference was done in kind of indirect way. So the question is this approach okay, or should we change this, or I don't know, any comments, any questions? There was a thread created by Solly Rose on SIG API Machinery group, but there was only David commenting there. Do you have any feedback on that?
I could say I haven't seen this, but I'd like to have a look at it since you've brought it like up on this agenda, because I don't totally understand, but so I think the answer is you'll get some feedback after having asked the question this way, at least for me.
Yeah, I added Matt to the PR. I didn't understand the question, but we can look after the meeting.
Like the high level question is, we have some API, we want to graduate this to beta, and I would like to hear some feedback from you, especially on how to reference the object that metrics are attached to.
Yeah, I mean, I left the answer as it's reasonable to not have duplicate information. If you want, there's actually more information in the email thread, whoever's scrolling through. There's a specific example about, I have a pod metric, its mapping is based on this name. You could add redundant information if you wanted to. That, API Machinery is about giving you the tools to do what you want in your API. The shape of your API is yours.
I'm having trouble deciding or understanding if this is a question about the contents of the API, in which case we're more or less neutral, or if this is about the like mechanisms by which the API is implemented, in which case we might have opinions.
So the question is about the mechanism, I would say. Like we have one object, pod. We have some other object that is describing the original object, like pod metrics, and we would like to how to basically express the relationship between them.
So this is the question of like access review APIs, which were sort of imperative, and you're saying like, tell me something about this, not this RBAC rule, but like this user, even though it's not really a user object, and then so the spec is kind of small, and then the status has whatever loss of information.
That's not
kind of imperative, not declarative.
This API, the question was about, in my API, how do I create a reference from one object to another?
And does he actually need to reference it, or does he just want like the URL to be saying, tell me more about this other object?
I think the answer, so the URL is so basically the URL is the following pattern, that there is basically you are asking for metrics from a specific pod. So it's okay, but the goal while designing the API was to have the answer self-descriptive. I'm not sure whether this is a good approach here, but so probably when you are asking for pods, when you are querying for pods, you can see the whole pod configuration, and it's self-descriptive. You know what is the pod name, what is the pod namespace, and so on.
Oh, I see.
So in the result of the query for metric API, you also want to see which pods the metrics are attached to.
Right, and you want information about that pod, where ordinarily you might see nothing more than a serialized reference in other objects. In this object, you're saying you'd like to put more information that duplicates information from the pod itself.
Yep.
Yeah, okay. It's still not necessarily a machinery question, but it's one that I'll have opinions on. I think SIG architecture might be a good other SIG to loop in on this, because that is sort of their thing.
Yeah, I tend to agree. I'll try and take a look after this.
Yeah, so actually this is about, in my opinion, this is about mechanism. So how to, what is the best way to reference between objects. Anyway, I suggest I will post some questions in the mentioned issue, and I would love to hear some feedback there. Does it make sense?
Yeah.
Okay. Thank you very much.
All right. Next on the list, initializers and/or dynamic admission in general. We sort of had a goal of going to beta this quarter, but I think there's quite a lot to do, and the code freeze deadline is rapidly approaching. Heidi, can you open that link up?
I think there was more from the list from a while back. I can go find some of the other things.
Yeah, there's other lists in this bug. This was my list with
Okay.
a few things that I think absolutely have to happen if we're going to call it beta. Like all the API changes need to happen, and like beta means we're turning it on by default, so we can't have any bad interactions between the controllers and the initialization mechanism.
Yeah, I can go through and try to collect from the other lists as well, because there are some I still see, say, mutability out of webhook.
So webhooks and initializers are actually two different APIs, so they can go to beta at different times.
True. I guess I see it as a P0.
The entire feature needs them.
Change.
The entire feature requires both. With the webhooks, we definitely need to figure out how the mutability is going to affect the API before we call it beta.
Yeah, I also see making these work on a generic API server as required for beta. Or I don't think we can reasonably call it beta if it can't work on aggregated API servers.
Yeah, I agree that that's a major thing that we should consider.
I think the other major thing is the garbage collection of slow to initialize objects. Otherwise,
is that something that breaks the cluster if it's not in?
if you also have broken initializers, you can break
So
the cluster.
I don't know about fixing, but could we have a convention for monitoring, like a VARZ that comes out of API server that is a map that summarizes naughty and nice initializers? I'm not sure that's beta, but certainly it's GA.
We probably need something like that. I don't know if that addresses this problem.
Monitoring, at least a monitoring plan.
Yeah. So I think what I'm hearing here is there's actually quite a lot to do on this feature before it can be legitimately called beta. Does anyone agree with that summary?
I do, yes.
You disagree or you agree?
I agree.
Yeah, okay. Does anybody feel like it's worth burning the candle at both ends to try and get this to beta in this release?
I don't think it's practical.
I don't think it's practical
like a
either.
10-minute candle for that.
Yeah. I basically, this is my way of saying I don't think it's going to go to beta in 1.8. Okay. Let's go on to the next item unless somebody else has something to add here.
Decision. I think also the goal was made before we had a list of what was required to go to beta, so I think it's totally reasonable that touching on that list was quite a lot.
Yeah, it actually turns out this is a really major feature that has a lot of little loose ends that need to be tied up.
Yeah, so I think all the right things are happening. It's just what did beta mean was not well defined. So.
Yep. Okay. Manual push syncs to Kubernetes repos. What does this mean?
Joe, do you want to talk? I do it. So I talked to Joe in the last days about our publish robot, which is broken for 4 weeks, and there's quite some work to update the algorithm in a way that it doesn't break on those events which we had, like merges on branches and so on. We have a couple of people who are blocked at the moment because we don't have published repos. So everything is 4 weeks old, basically. And the proposal is, so we have the algorithm is implemented. It's not reviewed in a way that we can merge it into test infra. But we have manually reviewed exports in private forks at the moment. And the proposal is to push that manually, as we have done before in the past, to update our staging repos. So this includes, of course, client Go, but also metrics. Metrics is quite critical for some people. API is important, of course.
I'm having a really hard time understanding.
Hearing.
Yeah, hearing.
Chao, can you repeat? Maybe it's easier for you.
So we had a bug in the publishing robot that caused it to fail like 3 or 4 weeks ago, and there are people that are blocked by this situation. And STTTS has fixed the robot. The algorithm is quite complex, so we don't plan to review the algorithm this week, but we do want to push the changes generated by the algorithm.
Oh, okay.
We want to do a manual push to all those repos.
So it's not that you constructed the patches manually, it's that you want to push them manually.
Just the changes. Yeah.
I think I'm okay with that. What is the request, or what?
It's just a general approval. Eric Paris volunteered to do that. I give him a script to do that.
Okay.
Just that everybody knows, and yeah.
Yeah, maybe I don't know for sure, but I don't think there's any huge risk here, and we can always roll back a bogus change if necessary.
That's true. Yes.
Yeah.
So I say go ahead.
Yeah, I think I'm okay with that.
Okay.
Other objections? Going once, going twice? Okay. Deep copy gen usage examples.
Yeah, I was just wondering if someone had a good canonical example of how to use the deep.
Can you get closer to your mic, please?
Yeah, sure. Is this better?
Yes.
Okay. So I was wondering if anyone had examples for the new deep copy gen that's required to satisfy the object interface. It looks like there's some docs, but I was just wondering out of just speed if anyone had a good example. Otherwise, I can try to put one together.
There's no official doc for that. We have our big make file, but it's not a good example. And we have a couple of external repos. So if you think about CRDs, for example, how to apply that, I can give you links for that. I can paste it into the document.
Yeah, that'd be great. Thanks.
Okay. API server count fix. Oh boy.
Yeah, that's me. So I just wanted to bring it up for visibility that I'm working on this. And it seems like the general consensus-ish is to use the OpenShift lease reconciler. And I have some code around it already. I'm working out some of the testing issues currently locally, but is there anyone that doesn't like that fix for this issue, or should something else be done?
Does that mean that you're going to talk directly to etcd?
It's going to use the storage API layer to do that, yes.
Okay, and it's not going to be using a existing API object?
Correct, it's going to use a new one, I believe.
But it's not going to be an API object at all. It's just going to be an object in the storage layer?
Correct, yes.
So I think the eventual, like, API server is doing something that we supply, is re-implementing a feature that we supply to other things that run in the cluster. Like right now, you start a service, there's a controller that finds the pods that run in the service, and it updates the endpoints record, and people can see all the things that are running in the cluster.
Mm-hmm.
API server is re-implementing this in a very hacky way. So I think ultimately we would want to leverage the existing controller The problem is bootstrapping. I think once you're in steady state, it should all work, but making sure that you can get to steady state from startup is problematic.
The problem is that when new API nodes come into the cluster and they leave the cluster, that count of endpoints, or that the endpoints within
I understand the existing mechanism is hacky and depends on administrators knowing exactly how many API servers they're running.
Right.
That's a problem that other applications don't have, because the endpoint controller just goes out and continuously finds it and updates that.
Is it possible? I mean, I don't know everything about the issue we're trying to solve here, but one thought is, in the long run, that we could run the endpoint controller in a special standalone mode, essentially reusing as much of the code as we can, but running it in a special mode, which its only job to do is to make sure that this bootstrap thing works right. Kind of the way you run a kubelet in a standalone only mode to get a machine off the ground.
Or we could think about taking controllers that implement core or like nucleus layer functionality, of which endpoints is nucleus layer. We could think about running that controller in API server itself. That way we could depend on it.
I thought about that, and then I thought about, instead of that, on the same machine as the API server, running a binary, but in like the sort of standalone, I'm bootstrapping the Kube API server mode. That's all it does.
But that doesn't help you solve the problem in the short term.
Right.
Is it? I take it this is a pressing issue for somebody somewhere.
Yeah. So I work for Core OS, and so it's one of our customer issues.
I see. I mean, I'm not adamantly against using the lease concept to work with etcd directly.
I mean, it's not even working with etcd directly. It's working with the storage directly.
Sorry, Clayton, you're very quiet.
Oh, how about now?
Slightly better.
It's working with storage, right? There's no actual etcd code in this. It uses the same storage that has to work for events and other things.
Yeah.
You can think of it as an API object that we just never need to tell anybody about.
It's a little bit like API the allocations objects, which we abuse a little bit, which are, we go through storage, we are abstracted from the underlying storage layer. Yeah. The underlying storage layer has to support TTL, like it's required.
The IP allocation objects are also a little scary. I would like fewer things like this in the future rather than more, because imagine some poor cluster administrator, something breaks about their cluster and they need to go dig around in etcd to fix it, and there's all this stuff in etcd that they're not familiar with.
No, I would agree. And the reason why all the allocation stuff is in the core is because we didn't have initializers. But we need to get initializers stable and ready before we can use them to do the initializer stuff. And so
that's a great point. That's a great candidate for initializers.
Yeah, there's issues open for all of the service. For all of the allocators, there are issues open for that. It's really like this particular case, if we don't know enough about how do we really solve this for everyone the right way, why are we trying to rush something in versus keeping the details undercover? Yeah, it's one slightly ugly thing, but like we've had zero problems with this, and like there's a lot of OpenShift clusters that have been running like this for at least a year. So it's like, from a trade-off perspective, it's the least scope that it adds to the project because it hides all the details. And I agree, it's a little weird.
That's a great point. And things that don't show up in APIs are things that we can swap out the implementation for later. And so this does cross one layer, which is like the API server storage layer. So it's not completely innocent, but it's certainly way better than having the hack built into the public API.
And the API servers are allowed, and if only the core API server did this, it would probably be better, because everything besides the core API server should be able to rely on pods and endpoints?
Yeah, absolutely. This should only be in the Kube API server binary. It should not be in the generic API server library. It should not be in any user-supplied API server. It shouldn't be in CRD. It shouldn't be in the aggregator.
And I think scoping it that way helps make this be like, can we do one small thing that just works, that uses something we're already doing in some other form, and is fairly production tested at this point?
Yeah. Okay.
I think it is restricted only to the API server at the moment. Is the master component part of Kubernetes, new to Kubernetes? Is that master component part of any other component besides the API server?
You're talking about the package master in the main.
Correct. Yeah.
That is the guts of the
okay.
server binary. It's not shared.
Okay, cool.
Not shared by generic API servers? Okay.
No, separate package. And there's a dependency enforcer that makes sure that we never accidentally run it the other way around.
Yeah, and like the other core controllers that run on the API servers that do the other mucky bits that we would prefer don't have to exist will eventually go away, and master should be mostly generic. Even at the end of the day, 2 years from now, I'm pretty sure we'll still have a little bit of ugly in the core API server because it is different than all the other API servers.
Yeah. Okay.
Question on initializer. Were you talking about making the service IP?
Yeah. Yeah, service IP has to be atomically allocated before it becomes visible to end users because that's the API contract we have.
Yeah.
A controller could do it better. My only worry with that was if there are core components that depend on services having an IP, the masters write hard-coded IPs into that map on startup. So like Kubernetes.service and the insecure Kubernetes service, both hard code which IPs they take.
So a potential problem with doing IPs as an initializer
Can I stop this scope creep here? I think we've answered the question on the agenda.
Someone's going to write beautiful words about what we thought in the issue?
Yes.
Because it is the last item on the agenda, and I think this is something different, right?
Well, yes, this is referring to a previous item on the agenda, getting initializers to beta. Implementing IPs, allocated IPs as an initializer has the same problem as implementing quota as an initializer, which is if something passes the quota check and the quota is deducted, but then it fails further on in the stack, we need some way of
counterbalancing.
Well, today that's done with a reconciliation controller at some later time.
Yeah. But that means if you like consume all of your quota and with a bad pod, it might take a little while before you can do anything.
And
yeah, I bet you that's not the only problem with quota.
Yeah, that also pre-exists today. So initializers wouldn't be fixing it, but we wouldn't be making that worse either.
Okay, this is something we should think about when we're moving things to initializers.
Yeah, they don't have transactions, so it's a little harder.
Yeah. Okay.
We'll do that transactions now.
We have made it all the way through our agenda. I will take an action item to write up our conclusions on the API server count fix.
Can we make sure to articulate the exception, and we shouldn't be doing this again and again in the comments of the code or somewhere where we will keep ourselves honest in the future?
Otherwise, somebody's going to come right along to that. Be like, this is exactly what I need.
Yeah. Yeah, that typically happens in this project. Is bad solutions.
So it might actually be better if we write up a good doc on what the purpose of the core API server's differences from a generic API server is, and then reference that from the bit of code that does the core loops.
Yeah.
Because I don't think that's clear to anybody else outside of a few people.
Yeah. Okay.
Okay. That is.
Okay. Anything else?
Did you guys talk about the list chunking proposal yet?
The API paging, I have that open up in a tab. I saw a lot of activity on it. I really want to read it.
Well, we already merged the proposal because enough people look good to me did. So at this point, Daniel, if you want to stop it before Friday, now would be a good time to do a quick review. But Jordan and I were on track to merge, given that enough people have weighed in on the various trade-offs. A good chunk of the SIG has reviewed it.
Okay. Was there anything controversial about it?
It's still going to be alpha and disabled by default in 1.8. I'm going to turn it on. So the proposal right now is turn it on, let it soak in, because it's really difficult to get speculative code into all of the sub branches. Put it in, and we'll just disable the client side aspect of it before we ship, probably next week once we get enough signal. But the feature on the server side is disabled by default. The client is much, much more difficult to globally disable or enable. And so I was going to, in master, for a period of time, the code will opt into paging, and then we'll turn that off before we ship.
I think, yeah, the client should respect whatever the server is set.
Yeah, the server just ignores it, but I don't want a 1.8 client going out the door that talks parameters that aren't respected yet, and then we realize we need to change them, so then we have to deal with old clients. That would be the
yeah, I agree. That's yeah.
So, but I want soak time in master because we have no evidence that this causes any issues, but given the masses of testing that aren't covered by PR tests, especially CubeMark and the higher scale density tests, there's no easy way to do this.
Sounds good. All right. Sounds like we're done early.
Okay. Thanks, everybody.
See you all later.
Thanks.